Entering the Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, continuing Masters coverage week today. DraftKings Masters Millionaire Maker ownership projections, which figures to be the most important show of all, because in the Millionaire Maker, with such a top-heavy prize pool, you're going to have to game the field a little bit and find those sneaky plays to build around some of the chalk you probably want to take. We all know who the favorites are, but it's getting those lower-owned guys, the Thomas Peters of 2018. Or actually, the Thomas Peters of 2017. In 2018, if you can find those guys, boom, and they hit. You're at the top of the leaderboard if the rest of your lineup hits. So, joining me on the show to break it all down is Jeff Bergerson from FantasyGolfInsider.com and Colin Drew, the ownership guru from Daily Roto. But before we get to them, I do want to let everyone know that there is golf's first major package up on the DraftKings store right now. If you check the description of this podcast or video, there's a $9.99 version or a $4.99 version. The $4.99 version just has my rankings along with Jeff Ulrich's and player blurbs on each player. The $9.99 version, course history, stats that matter, DraftKings Millionaire Maker retro data based on ownership percentages, cut-made percentages, DraftKings scoring percentages. There's a lot of info in there and can really go a long way into helping you get above the rest. And of course, I gotta tell you about FantasyNational.com. You can get on the plan now, weekly, monthly, yearly. I would prefer yearly. It's cheaper that way on a weekly basis instead of just paying for week. But get your feet wet with it. Lineup generators, every stat you can need, a custom model tournament simulator. It is the one-stop shop for daily fantasy golf, or if you just like betting on golf, because it'll help you out with that too. Search whatever you want on it, customize it any way you want. Super easy to use. FantasyNational.com. Got plenty of shows already out this week. You can go back and check those out. Plus, on Wednesday, a live chat at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the DraftKings YouTube and Facebook page. Then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, we got some recap shows for round 1 and round 3. And on the Friday, live cut sweat show with myself and Jeff Feinberg in studio. We're going to be watching the final 2 hours or so of the second round to get you ready for the weekend, to talk about the tournament so far. And hey, if you got nothing to do on Friday, come hang with Jeff and I. We're good times, all right? So let's get into the guests today. We have Jeff Feinberg from FantasyGolfInsider.com. Like I mentioned, Jeff, are you burnt out on the Masters yet or what?
You just called me Jeff Feinberg, Pat, and that's actually a compliment, so I will take it.
You know what? Everything's just so rattled my head. I apologize. Jeff Bergerson, the more handsome of the Jeffs. How about that?
Oh, wow, that's nice. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be on, Pat.
What do you guys have offered right now? What's already released on FantasyGolfInsider.com?
Yeah, we got all of our articles posted. My hardcore core for GPP strategy and the core that I'll be using on my teams. We got the lineup generator locked and loaded, so you can put in whatever percentages you want. The FGI models ready to go with all of our baseline stats, but it's customizable so everyone can change how they see fit. If they want to favor a certain stat over another, then they can do that. So everything's ready to go, and we only got a few days left. So we're ready.
Colin Drew, DailyRoto.com. What is over at DailyRoto.com since I talked to Leone last Wednesday?
Yeah, we got everything live as well. The fantasy golf projections and optimizer, obviously, but also a bunch of good betting tools. So not just for fantasy, if you're looking to do any betting, we have head-to-head 3-ball betting tools, top 20 tools, and then obviously the ownership projections as well, which we'll get into a little bit here. And we are running a promo this week. So with the promo Masters, you can actually get weekly access for just $1. So a great opportunity to check us out.
All right, so let's talk about those ownership projections, because that's why we're here, to figure out who's going to be highly owned, who's going to be lowly owned. And Colin, I'll start with you on this. As it pertains to the DraftKings Millionaire Maker, I think that you need to game your strategy a little bit more than a more flat payout structure. How important is projecting ownership when it comes to a tournament like this?
I think it's critical. I would say that I put as much weight into the ownership projections, and where I think guys will come in as I do the actual trying to project who's going to win the tournament. So at the end of the day, a lot of times it's easier to project ownership, and that can provide a lot of value. And so I think, especially for a tournament like the DraftKings Millionaire Maker, where so much of the money goes to the top 5 spots, I think that trying to find those leverage spots is important, just to maximize your ROI, and then also to avoid duplicate lineups, because so many people are going to run similar lineups to each other. So ownership projections are one of the most important things I think this week for putting together your DFS lineups.
Jeff, how much does it influence you or at all? Like, would a high ownership on a middle tier, low price player get you off of them, knowing that if that chalk doesn't hit, you stand to benefit a lot?
Yeah, it depends. I would say the downside is much less this week for the Masters than it normally is, just because we have such a condensed field. The cut, just about everyone makes the cut with this field because we have 85 guys, and 15 are really kind of non-factor. So you're going to have like 55, maybe 60 guys through the cut. The downside of a guy missing a cut isn't as great, so I don't think the strategic fade is as meaningful as it normally is. It's still a factor. And what I like to do is I'm not afraid to roster chalk in the Masters, because if it hits, you need to be on it. But then with the rest of your lineup, and we've talked about this a lot before, Pat, is making sure you do have some contrarian parts to your lineup. You mentioned Thomas Peters before. You could have went chalky last year with, Sergio Rose. And if you mix in Peters, then all of a sudden you're separating yourself from the rest of the field. And I think you really have to do that when you're building your lineups, is make sure you do have some contrarian components to them.
Yes, I think that is the key factor right there. Making lineups that have contrarian elements to them. Just picking 6 guys who no one's going to own probably isn't going to work out very well. And I think that people misconstrue that sometimes as, oh, I can't have guys that are highly owned. Listen, like when we get into it, I'm going to have a lot of Spieth and Justin Rose. Probably going to be very highly owned. I'm okay with that. I think that they're 2 guys who have an excellent shot to win this. So if you think that anyone is going to win, don't let anyone talk you off of them, because you're going to need that guy in your lineup. So here's the winning Masters lineup from last year in the Millionaire Maker. Paul Casey, 21.8% owned. Ricky Fowler, 31.34% owned. Sergio Garcia, 18.9% owned. Justin Rose, 26.6%. Matt Kuchar, 9.9%. Thomas Peters, 4.4%. So as you can see, those are 4 chalk plays. One guy who's off the board and another guy at Matt Kuchar at 9.9%. It's not like he was unowned. So do you think, Colin, that is the proper type of roster that you want to build as it pertains to ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I think that type of build makes some sense. Obviously, you're looking at the winning roster there and not necessarily the ROI of all the people who happen to roster a 30% owned player. And so obviously, if the player wins, you're going to need him in the lineup. But I think one of the things that I try to do is compare the T20 odds is a gauge that I like to use to compare to the ownership to figure out, guys that might be low owned that still have a decently high probability of doing well. Obviously, you're not trying to find just a 1% flyer just to have someone at 1%. You're looking for someone who has a reasonable upside. And I think in the, DraftKings Millionaire Maker, you're looking for all 6 of the guys to have a chance at finishing inside the top 20. And obviously, you're going to have the winner and another player or 2 inside the top 5.
So the year before that, the winning lineup in 2016, it had a relatively chalky Danny Willett at 17% owned. And then you had, let's see here, Hideki.
Troy Merritt.
Yes, Hideki Matsuyama at 13, Paul Casey at 16, Lee Westwood at 2.7, Spieth at 9.7, and Troy Merritt at 3.3%. So from 2017, the average ownership in the winning lineup was over 18%. In 2016, it was 10.4%. And the first time around, both of the sort of chalkier bottom plays, Charlie Hoffman and Kevin Na, were in the lineup. I remember, Jeff, you and I discussed it that year, actually, on my old show.
We did.
That we thought that both those guys were going to end up being chalky. Charlie Hoffman didn't end up being that way. He was only 8% owned. Kevin Na, 18.5% owned, still in that lineup. You had a 30% Spieth, an 11% Phil Mickelson, 16% Russell Henley, and the big one was Justin Rose at 3.5%. I don't think we're going to get him that low this time around. What do you think?
No. You could put 0 behind that probably.
Yeah, you may. Hell, you might be able to put 2 zeros behind it. So let's get into the first range as it pertains to the top of the pricing. The big 4 players, all over $10,000. You have DJ, you have Thomas, you have Spieth, and you have Woods. So when I think about it, I didn't think Spieth would be as highly owned as a lot of people, as he probably will be right now. And I can actually see him being by far the highest owned of this group now. I think he's surpassed Tiger, even with so much of the public coming in. He played so well in Houston. That's what people were looking for. It's not like his putting was any better. He still lost 3.2 strokes on the greens. It's just he went up and up and up and tee to green. So I would think that Spieth is the chalk in this range, followed by Tiger, then Justin Thomas, then Dustin Johnson. I think that Dustin Johnson can come in somewhere between like 10 and 13% in ownership in the Millionaire Maker. And if that's going to be the case, I'm going to own like 20, 25% of Dustin Johnson and still have all my Spieth shares. Colin, what do you see this range playing out as in terms of the range of ownerships available?
I think that you're right that DJ and JT, I think to me, it's going to be more of a coin flip between those two guys for the lowest owned of this range. I know one of the resources I like to use is fansharesports.com, and they have DJ being slightly higher tagged, and they're both DJ and JT are similar in the betting markets. So I can see those guys carrying similar ownership. I think Tiger's going to end up slightly higher than Spieth. Early in the week, I was kind of leaning your way, but it is such a public tournament that so many people are going to want to play Tiger. And then also just the media hype just is going to continue to build on Tiger. You're already seeing reports from the practice round today of him eagling 2 of the par 5s on the back 9. And so like all that stuff is going to build to the point where the Tiger hype by the time Thursday rolls around, I think is going to leave him the highest owned out of this group.
Jeff, what do you make of it? Because when I think about Tiger, I'm just looking at the ownership projections from Fantasy National right now, and a lot of it is built-in data of people putting in lineups. So the people that are playing from Fantasy National and building their lineups that way isn't necessarily reflective of the public at large. And it seems to me like a lot of sharp people that play DraftKings golf week to week to week are taking more of a Tiger fade stance and letting the public own him. And I think that might drive down his ownership just a little bit. I still expect him to be in like the 20 to 25% range. I just think Spieth might surpass that. What do you see from these top 4?
Yes, definitely. When you're trying to figure that out, you have to factor in the type of contest. Generally with the masses, JT is just not a popular guy. When you look at his ownership so far, they've got 15%, 13%, 17%, 13%, 18%, 7%. That was coming off a win at Honda, and 12%. He's just never highly owned because he's just not that popular. And when you see him in the $4 contests, those type of numbers, that would lead me to believe that he's probably going to be in that 13 to 15% range in the Millionaire Maker this week, as opposed to DJ, who this year has been owned 24%, 31, 39, 14, and 22. He's just a more popular guy. I don't know if it's just his power, although JT is, just as powerful, or just his image or whatever, but generally more popular. I do think it's going to be close between the two, and they will be the 2 lowest owned in this top range. I have Spieth a little bit higher than Woods, but I think right around in that mid 20. I think a combination of you, Pat, saying you're all in on Spieth is going to be a factor with a lot of the golf community. And then also people are kind of looking for a reason, and they kind of got it last week with his performance. And again, he missed several 3-foot putts. So he makes those, and he probably wins last week. And I actually think his ownership would have been lower.
Yeah, it's funny to say that. So I actually think that Dustin Johnson will end up being lower owned solely because of the price. And then you have the Spieth and Tiger factor, because there's going to be very few lineups to be able to be made with Dustin Johnson and Spieth, or Dustin Johnson and Tiger Woods. If you're building a Dustin Johnson lineup because he's $600 more than Justin Thomas, you're now building a Dustin Johnson, presumably where the chalk lies, Justin Rose or Paul Casey lineup. So if the ownership is going to be really high on Spieth and Woods, you could play those two in a lineup if you wanted to. You can't really do that as easily with Dustin Johnson. So I think that the savings from Thomas from Dustin Johnson is going to make Dustin Johnson, like I said, in that 12% range. So in the $9,000 level, when we drop down, we got Rory, Day, Phil, Rose, Rahm, Fowler. And I'll even chuck Paul Casey onto that list too at 8,800 because I think that he's going to be super highly owned. Jeff, I'll ask you first. Will Justin Rose be the highest owned guy in the Millionaire Maker?
Yeah, I think he will. I projected his ownership at 30%. You just get that great value. And especially when you're playing in the high dollar contest where guys are just always all about value. In like the 1,500 or the Thunderdome, he'll be owned by like 40, 50% possibly. Millionaire Maker purposes, I have him at about 30%. and I think he will be, probably the highest owned.
What do you think, Colin? Do you think that Justin Rose gets up to the 30+ level here?
I think he flirts with 30. I've got him in the high 20s right now. And it seems like the only thing that's going to keep that down is the fact that, you put out your content so early, which is awesome. But Rose was obviously going to be the chalk as soon as you released your content. So many people had him pegged as the winner. And so there are going to be some people who know that and take active stances to try to fade Rose, whereas guys who are emerging as chalk later in the week, people might not feel as confident. So I know we saw that earlier this year with Hideki Matsuyama at the Waste Management, where everyone thought he was going to be the highest owned, and nobody ended up playing him because they were trying to, game theory the contest. I think in the Masters, so much public money in, and the field is so large that it's going to be hard for Rose to go overlooked. So I do think he's going to be the highest. I would say he won't crack 30 though.
Okay, so what do you do with Justin Rose then? Are you someone that's going to be massively overweight on Justin Rose? Or does it even make sense to be underweight on him, or you just fade him completely if you're not going to be overweight?
Yeah, I think a lot of that ends up depending what type of contest you're playing and where you think the ownership might lie in those contests.
We're talking Millie Maker here.
Millie Maker, I think you have to fade him at that. There's other guys who have comparable odds to finish inside the top 20 that are going to be found at half the ownership. And so, like, you're a betting man, and the odds and the return you're getting on a guy is one of the big factors. And so I think in that top-heavy Millionaire Maker, I won't have any Justin Rose.
All right, so Jeff, with you, after Justin Rose, who do you think ends up becoming the second highest owned of this area?
I would say it's going to be a dead heat between Paul Casey and Bubba Watson.
Oh, really?
Yep. I think Paul Casey probably at about 20%, and Bubba high teens. I think he's gonna get up there as well.
Yeah, what about Phil then? Because I think that we talked about the influence that the public could have on Tiger Woods' ownership. The same people that are lining up to play Tiger, and I've even seen this populate my Twitter timeline from brand new followers that they're all telling me that their teams are going to be Tiger and Phil. That's their team. So I can see Phil being a little bit higher. And I actually kind of like Phil a little bit. I like him more than Tiger this week. I have a really tough time gauging where his ownership is going to be. So Colin, what do you think? Over, under 16.5% for Phil?
I think it'll be over 16.5%. I have Phil being fairly high owned this week. Combination of the public money. He's been talked a lot by all the touts and analysts and everything, and so I think he's going to carry high ownership. I agree that Casey, and if we are dipping, including Bubba into the range, I agree that Casey and Bubba are going to carry slightly higher ownership. I think Bubba will end up as the highest owned of those three players, just because of his form coming in. He kind of follows that same mold that DJ was last year, winning the Genesis Open and then winning the match play. And obviously having won twice at Augusta, we know that course history is something that drives ownership a lot as well. So I could see Bubba being maybe the second or third highest owned person in this entire field.
Okay, so who do you think of the $9,000 players, who do you think will be the lowest owned? Because I didn't want to say it was going to be Ricky, but it's really shaping up to be Ricky right now. Other than that, I think it's going to be Jason Day.
Yeah, my model says it's going to be Ricky. My gut says maybe John Rahm, just because I think that Fowler is another popular name that people like to click. And so he does offer a little bit of savings. But right now I have both Rahm and Fowler as close to 10% owned. And Day is just a little bit above that. But I think those three are the guys that you'd be looking for as kind of leverage off of the field. And Day I like particularly in the Millionaire Maker because we have him as a really high probability to finish inside the top 10 at a low ownership. And so that can provide you a lot of leverage. And we have seen in the past, I believe one of those years that Rose was on the winning lineup was when he was coming in with some of the question marks around his wrist. And he was like 3 or 4% owned, and he was on the winning team there.
Yeah, so Jeff, what do you think of that $9,000 range, where the potential pivot plays are, that if you did want to take a Jordan Spieth or Tiger, because they're going to be very highly owned, if you had to pair them up with a lower owned guy in the $9,000 area, I think it's going to be Rahm who's going to be the lowest owned. I'm going to be using a lot of Rahm because of that, but where do you think that the ownership falls away from with these guys?
Agree with you. I think Rahm and then Day and then Ricky. In that order of popularity. And there probably isn't going to be a ton of separation between the three, but that's the order I think it'll shake out.
So what do we make of Rory then? He's sitting there at $9,900.
I think he's going to be popular this week. I think he's going to be 20 plus.
20 plus. Colin, what do you guys have him projected for?
Just under 20%. I think one of the things is we know everyone fills up all their salary cap, right? So many of the rosters end with either $50,000 spent or 49.9. And so if you put Rory at close to 20, but not quite there, then that basically leaves somewhere close to like 97% of the field spending at least on one of DJ, JT, Spieth, Woods, and Rory. And that makes a lot of sense to me as far as how people might try to start their lineups.
All right, well, Colin, let me ask you this then. Should you make any lineup that is more than $49,800?
Yeah, I think you can. So the two ways that I've been talking about doing it with Mike Leone, who I know you had on earlier, one is that you can set a salary cap on your overall team just to avoid duplicates. But I think the other way that you can do it is to set an ownership cap. And that's one of the things that our optimizer lets you do that I think is pretty cool is say, hey, I want to make sure that in total, my team doesn't have more than 75% ownership, for example. And so that would be another way that you can go about avoiding duplicates is by capping the ownership. So then it might give you teams with rows because, obviously the projection models really like rows this week, but it would make sure to pair rows up with lower owned players.
Yeah, Jeff, you guys did a big study on the total ownership of teams as it pertains to winning big GPPs almost every single year. You and Zach go back and look at it and try to figure out where the soft spot is. For the Millionaire Maker, it seems really random when you look at the winners. I mean, we just went over the 3 lineups, and one of them was kind of chalky. The other one had 3 guys that were sub 10%. So what do you think is like an ownership cap that you would be looking for a lineup here?
Yeah, so our normal target somewhere between 70 and 90%, but for the Masters, that aggregate is going to be higher just because the condensed field, the higher ownership, the people gravitating toward the more popular players, and just higher ownership overall. So I would say bump that up a little bit. I would go to the high end and say 90% because we've seen it upwards of 100%, like you had mentioned winning lineups before. So I'd target somewhere, between maybe 80 and 100.
Would you fill out all your salary cap when building lineups, or would you leave a little on the table just to avoid the duplicates?
I probably, it depends on how many lineups you're making. I wouldn't be too concerned about capping out your roster if you think that you're going to be contrarian in a couple of different spots. I wouldn't really look at that. When I set my target on our lineup generator, I usually make sure that there's not any more left on the table than $1,000. But I don't, there isn't any minimum on there. So I sometimes do hit that cap mark with my teams.
Okay, let's jump back into the $8,000 range. We already talked about Paul Casey and Bubba Watson being the chalk of the upper tier. What does that do to the ownership of Sergio and Tommy Fleetwood? Because the more I think about it, the more I think that no one's going to own Tommy Fleetwood, and I might just need to load up on him. Wow, what do your numbers say, Colin?
Yeah, I think Tommy Fleetwood will be one of the lower owned players of this group, especially of the guys that have a strong chance to contend. And I definitely think after the pairings came out, I believe Fleetwood is starting with Tiger. So
yes,
that's going to be something that people are looking to avoid as well. Whether or not there's any merit to that, people don't like to play guys that are playing with Tiger. So I think Fleetwood, I don't think he'll come in at like 5% or anything like that, but I could think you could get him at the high single digits or around 10% ownership. The only guys I think that will be lower owned than Fleetwood in this range would be Thomas Pieters and Mark Leishman.
Okay, so Jeff, when I talk about Sergio and Hideki, who sandwich Tommy Fleetwood, where do you think that they fall? Because there seems to be a lot of buzz about Hideki, and Leone's probably the one who started it after he picked him to win, but he's still dealing with the wrist injury. I don't even know how much of the public actually knows that he's only been back twice, and one of them was a match play, and the other one, he gained a bunch of strokes around the green, and that's basically all he did to get his decent performance out of it. So I'm going to have no Hideki here, and I don't think he's going to be quite as lowly owned as a lot of people thought almost 7 days ago. There seems to be a lot of buzz like, oh, Hideki's a sleeper, no one's going to own him, and then he turns into the guy who's like 16% owned.
Could be. I have him at 10% on ours. I think actually, Fleetwood, Matsuyama, Pieters, and Leishman will all be either 10 or lower between them. Maybe Matsuyama might get a little steam. I just think there's too many other options for people. And, there just isn't that much room for more ownership for Hideki because they're going to bump up to Casey or Watson up in the upper 8s and then drop down to the low 7K range. So I think Matsuyama actually gives you a tremendous amount of upside for his ownership. And, what's the difference if he's 10 or 13% owned. If you own, a quarter, a 25% Hideki, you got 2 times the field. So I kind of like it as a contrarian play at 8,400.
I was starting to think the same thing, but when I've been done 5 of these shows now, and there's one name that just never comes up, and we just even glossed over him right here. I said him once, and then he was never a part of this conversation. I think that people just assume people are going to own Sergio Garcia, and I don't think that anyone's going to own Sergio Garcia.
Yeah, we actually talked about that, Zach and I, on our webcast last night. Like, is he ignored? Because, I have not heard one person's talk about Sergio this year, defending champ, and he might get overlooked. If you can get him at possibly 15%, that's kind of crazy.
I'm thinking he's Colin, and you can kind of see where your numbers are coming in. I think he goes lower than that.
See, I think he ends up a little bit higher than that. I think there's 2 things that I look at. One is just how they're priced relative to the Vegas odds. And so Sergio's odds to finish inside the top 20 on Bet365 are substantially higher than Fleetwood and Matsuyama, Peters, Leishman, Noren, kind of all these other names in there. And so I do think that that's one thing that people are looking at when they're trying to put together lineups. And then Sergio also has been talked a little bit, maybe not in the DFS bubbles, but I think in this tournament, not everyone's consuming just DFS content. There's a lot of, power rankings and things out there. And I know Fanshare Sports, who aggregates a lot of the mentions, has Sergio with similar tags to Bubba Watson. Obviously, some of that is just because he's the defending champion, but I think Sergio will carry a decent amount of ownership. I actually have him above 15% right now.
All right, so all 3 of us kind of expect Peters and Leishman to be the 2 lowest owned of this area. Colin, does that still make them good plays? Because I'm not on either of them. I just don't see it.
I think Peters is still a bad play at the low ownership, just a little bit overpriced with these other guys around him, and would have him projected for really only like 20% odds to finish inside the top 20 at this event, despite how well he did here last year. So I think in that 8K range, I'd be looking more to Leishman for leverage. And possibly Alex Noren. I know he's not going to come off at single-digit ownership, but I think it's going to be close to 10%. And so with 41% odds to finish inside the top 20 per Data Golf's model, I think he provides you a good leverage play in that 8K range.
Well, it looks like Noren and Scott are going to be sort of the concentrated chalk at the bottom, at least compared to Leishman and Peters. That's where everyone is going. I prefer Adam Scott to Alex Noren. What do you think about their ownerships, though, Jeff? Do you think that Scott comes in higher, or do you think they'll be about the same?
We actually have them about equal in the low teens. And I think that's probably how it'll shake down. Adam Scott, clearly the more popular name of the 2 among the masses. So he might get a little edge over Noren, but we have them almost identical.
All right, I want to talk about lineup construction for a second when it comes to building lineups for the Millionaire Maker. And Colin, we'll start with you on this. I'm building 20 lineups, and this is a question that I get all the time, and I don't really know how to answer it. And I'm not even sure that there is a right answer. But if I'm playing 20 lineups, what should my player pool look like in a tournament like this? Because I'm someone that likes to make a hard stance. I'm very willing to be wrong, and I'm willing to lose my money if that's going to be the case. But I feel if I'm going to play so few lineups, if I was playing 150, I'd probably own a piece of a lot of these guys at the top end because of their win equity. But where I'm playing so few as compared to a lot of people who are playing tons, I feel like if I'm not going to be massively overweight on someone, I'm just not going to play them. Listen, Justin Thomas rates out great for me in everything that I run, but I'm going to play Dustin Johnson instead of Justin Thomas. Tiger Woods, listen, I think that Tiger could win. I'm going to play Jordan Spieth because I think that he's going to win, so I'm not going to play any Tiger. So how concentrated should you make your core? And should you make those tough decisions at the top end or the bottom end if you were only playing, let's say, 10 or 20 lineups?
Yeah, I think obviously it's a matter of risk tolerance. Obviously, Leone went it all in last year on Sergio, and that worked out really well. But there are a ton of people who went all in on other players and ended up getting $0 return. So I think the first thing you need to decide is, you're going to play 20 lineups. Are you okay getting $0 back and taking a shot for the top prize? And if you are, then I think it's okay to take more aggressive stances. Usually I'm doing something a little bit more balanced. So I would say generally I won't own more than 50% of a golfer across like a 20 lineup build. And if I'm building more than that, I might not own more than 40%. So I usually am willing to own more of the guys who are higher projected and the more expensive guys. And part of that is because their ability to sync your lineups is a lot lower. So even though the Masters has a really high probability of getting to the weekend and playing, I think you still are a lot more likely to get tanked if you go all in on a Charlie Hoffman, who, might project really well and is a nice value, but his ability to miss the cut is certainly a lot higher than a Jordan Spieth or a Tiger Woods is.
Jeff, how do you approach building lineups and concentrating percentages on certain players? Are you more of a push, not necessarily all in, but go massively overweight on one guy, or are you someone that likes to distribute it evenly a little bit?
I generally don't own a whole lot more than 50 to 60% per guy, but the mistake that I see a lot of people make is they just make their core too large. There's just too many guys and they have too little of ownership on guys. So if you're playing in a 20 max, you shouldn't own probably more than 15 guys in your core there. That's got to be tops, because you got to have a lot of you got to have exposure to guys so that when they do hit, you have multiple bullets, right? If you own a guy at 5% in a 20 max tournament, you own him on one team, and if he hits, you have to hit every other part of your roster. And I personally like a tighter core, and that way, if they hit, you give yourself many options, right? So if you own, let's say, Justin Thomas at 50%, and then you go with a bunch of tertiary guys down in that 7K range, you're banking a lot on Justin Thomas. But if he hits, you're going to have multiple chances to hit your core hard. And if you're playing large field GPPs, really, that's what we want to do. We don't care if we cash. I mean, yeah, it's nice if we cash, but we really want one of those top prizes because they are so top heavy weighted with the prize pool. So I'm playing to win those things. If I want a more balanced ROI, I'll play in cash games or real small field GPPs.
Let's jump to the upper $7,000 range, and it goes Louis, Stenson, Hatton, Reed, Koepka, Kuchar, Poulter, Cantlay, Berger, Xander, Harmon. That's the entire range there. It seems to me that everyone is now making the case for Henrik Stenson because he's massively underpriced. I agree that he's massively underpriced. Still not going to sway me into playing him. 0% Stenson for me. And then I see Matt Kuchar. I know Matt Kuchar is going to be popular. I just don't know how popular. So what do you think, Colin? How high does Kuchar get in ownership?
Got him just above 15% right now. I could see that taking up a tiny bit by the time all is said and done. So I think he's going to be the heaviest owned. I do think he'll come in heavier owned than Stenson, just because of his history at Augusta. So I think both of those guys are sort of like what I would call good chalk. I think even though they're going to be highly owned, I think you can still build lineups around them just because of their ability to make the cut and finish inside the top 20. I still think that they have some value compared to their top 20 odds, the way things are priced. You do get lingering ownership on both of them just because Kuchar is always such a cash game staple. So anyone who's building DFS lineups is used to just having Kuchar in there as that high floor guy in their lineups.
What do you make of it, Jeff? Do you think that those are the two guys that are going to concentrate most of the ownership? Because I have most of the rest of this range, not necessarily dead, but basically in the single digits.
I do too. Yeah, I have Kuchar at 16%. He's just a popular name among everybody. Consistency, good tournament history here. I think he'll have the most ownership in this upper 7K range. I don't really see anyone else that's going to even rival him. Stenson, I have at about 12%. I don't think he's going to get up to the Kuchar range, even though he is perceived as a great value at that price.
So what happens to the Hattons? What happens to the Reeds? What happens to all those guys in this area? I think that Cantlay probably comes in the third highest, and I would say probably 9, 10, 11% max for him. Is this almost, if you're trying to find last year's Thomas Pieters, is this the range to go find it in, Jeff?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you on the Cantlay. I think he'll be right around 9%. I think Hatton's going to be ignored just because he's not popular. People don't like him, and his performance last year was pretty awful here, so people are going to be scared of that. I think Usti could have a little bit of ownership, possibly double digits, but probably 9 or 10, I would say. But Cantlay's probably around the same area. And then Reed, I'm mixed on Reed. I have him at about 10%. Zach thought 7%. I'd be curious to see where you guys are at. Generally hasn't played well in major tournaments. Great short game and everything around the green. I have him at about 10. You agree?
I have Reed projected at 8% right now for the Millionaire Maker. And hey, it's one thing to have a great short game, but if you're relying on your short game too much, you ain't winning this week. You need to be hitting those greens in regulation. Colin, where do you have Patrick Reed?
Yeah, it's funny. You got Reed there with the great short game and not great ball striking. Then you have Cantlay with the great ball striking, not great short game. I've them both around 7.5%, 8%. So I agree with you there. I think Haddon will carry a little bit of ownership, like below both those guys, but pretty close in proximity just because of his odds. But all three of those guys feel like they are going to get lost in the mix between Stenson and Kuchar. And I definitely think that if you're building multiple lineups, that rotating in a Cantlay or a Reed is a good way to go as far as getting leverage off of the field and avoiding some of the other chalky players.
I just think for pivots for me in this region, I would just go in a different direction. I would take Ian Poulter at $7,600. I always have a really tough time gauging the ownership of guys that get added to the field later, but I do really like Ian Poulter in this spot. And instead of going with Patrick Cantlay, I would just much prefer to have Xander Schauffele. I think Xander Schauffele is a better player, and I think that he rates out very similarly to Patrick Cantlay, yet I've seen him win in big spots. Jeff, do you like any of the pivots in this range?
I do. I do like, I will have some Reed exposure, and I agree with you on Xander. I like him more than Cantlay, so I will have some smaller ownership on Xander here. I think his game sets up actually pretty well for Augusta, so I will own him, and I don't think he's going to be highly owned. He'll be, 8-9%, somewhere in that range.
I would think even lower. Colin, what do you make of Xander?
I think it'll be pretty low. I'm at 7% now, but I could see myself being wrong and being on the high side there. I personally would prefer Daniel Berger, I guess, as my pivot. I know he hasn't had the best form of late, and we haven't even seen as much of him as we usually do, but does have a decent track record at Augusta. And I think one of the things as you start to get through this range, and you get to the bottom of it, but then also when you get to the $7,000 ranges, you definitely are looking for guys who can score on those par fives, because so many of the DraftKings points, I think it was 45% of them came from the par fives last year as far as the scoring points related to birdies and eagles. And then you obviously have the streaks set up on the back nine as well. So I think you start to target the par five scoring. And so I definitely see what you're saying with Xander. I would probably play Berger over him, but it's I think they're kind of close as far as the ownership projection goes. And I do think that they'll be in the mid single digits.
I have Poulter at 6%. What do you have in that column?
7.
Jeff?
I have him at 7.
I thought he'd end up being more popular, but I think Kuchar is just sucking the steam out of everyone around him.
Yep.
All right, bottom of the $7,000 level then. So from this range, the guys that I have projected to be pretty popular, Charlie Hoffman, who is $7,100, Adam Hadwin, who's $7,200, Brendan Steele, who's $6,900. I guess we'll talk about the subs in a second, the sub 7,000s in a second. Outside of that, I just feel like Zach Johnson will carry some ownership because he's Zach Johnson. People like to play Tony Finau, who played DraftKings golf week after week. So I think that he'll be, 10%ish, but I don't see anyone being super crazily owned down here. I don't see anyone above 15%. And I know I'm going to be wrong about that because that always happens, that someone ends up just popping up being like, when flipping the coin between Hadwin and Charlie Hoffman, everyone picked Charlie Hoffman because he was $100 cheaper. One of them ends up at 7%, one of them ends up at 20%. Like that situation we talked about a little bit earlier, Jeff, between Kevin Na and Charlie Hoffman. That's what happened that year. So who do you see, Jeff, as the chalk from this low $7,000 range?
I do think it's going to be Hadwin. I think he's going to be him, and probably Henley will get a little bit of ownership as well here. I think those will be two of the higher two guys in this range. Hadwin, he was mentioned several times on your show. And I just don't see anyone else taking that ownership from him or Henley, who has a decent tournament history here and made a charge on Sunday, which some people saw as well.
This pains me, Colin, that if Hadwin's going to be so highly owned, he was one of my core players, that I don't know if I want to go eating the Adam Hadwin chalk if 17% of people are going to be on him. I might as well just diversify those shares onto Appy Barnrat, or I was going to say Webb Simpson, but I don't really want to go with Webb Simpson. Gary Woodland or Kevin Kisner or someone like that.
Yeah, I don't see Hadwin coming in quite as high as you guys are indicating maybe. I have him around 9%. So definitely decently owned, but not one of the highest owned players in the entire tournament. There's a lot of guys in this range that I think could carry similar ownership. You guys have flagged some of them. Charlie Hoffman, Russell Henley were two guys that were similar. I think Zach Johnson, even though the DFS community doesn't love Zach Johnson and doesn't talk about him, they still end up playing him. And then the DFS community loves Appy Barnrat. And I don't know how much of that ownership will carry through to a public millionaire maker, but I've him around 7.5%. I think this range ends up getting a little bit spread out. I know we'll get to the $6,900 range there. I think that's going to be the range that collects a ton of ownership. So I think you can get some decently high single digit, 10% or so ownership on these guys. And I actually really like Tony Finau as one of the potential Thomas Peters-esque millionaire maker plays this year, just because he kind of fits that same mold as a good DK scorer. Peters did get lost a little bit in the ownership shuffle last year. And so I think that Finau could be a guy that can score on the par 5, provide good value at, I have him around 5.5% ownership right now.
I have him around 10, but I think there's a choice that a lot of people are going to end up making. Maybe this pair of these guys all together and build with DJ at the top because they're very similar stats type players, but we talked about Cantlay, we talked about Finau, we talked about Xander, Colin. I prefer Xander the best of those three, and I think that he's going to end up being the lowest owned. So if you had to rank them, I would go Xander, Tony, and then Cantlay. And in ownership, I would go Cantlay, Finau, and then Xander. How would you play it out?
So for those guys, I would rate Cantlay as the best play, Finau is the second best, and Xander is the worst. I think in ownership, Finau is going to end up as the lowest owned. And so I still would have Cantlay as the best play in tournaments, even at a slightly higher ownership. I would have Finau as the second best play. And then I'll probably not end up with a lot of Xander. So one of us will be happy.
Jeff?
I'm going to go with Xander. Because I don't think the ownership would be the difference would be great enough for me to base my decision off the ownership, because I think they're going to be really close and tightly bunched. So I would go with Xander as my favorite out of those three.
Okay, so let's talk about the sub $7,000 level, and I think the chalk is pretty glaring down here. It's guys that not only that I've been talking about, that the people on the show have been talking about to me, the random Twitter golf community. I tune into Golf Channel. This is who they're all talking about. So it seems to me like guys that are going to carry double-digit ownership below $7,000 are going to be Brendan Steele, Kevin Chappell, Pat Perez, and Bryson DeChambeau, and no one else is even going to be close to those four. What do you make of it, Jeff?
I think DeChambeau will probably be. So my question to you guys, and I'm kind of mixed on this, is the Kevin Chappell. I think a lot of people like him, but they're a little bit worried about his back, and maybe they do need to be worried. What's going to overcome? Is it going to be the worry of his back, or is it going to be that he's such a great play at 6,900? I projected, 12% or so on Chappell, but I think that could vary tremendously. I have Bryson DeChambeau at about 10 to 12% as well. And then the other two that you mentioned, Perez and Steele, just below that.
Okay, so I have Bryson up around 18%, Chappell around 16%, Perez around 13%, and Steele around 10%. I guess the thing with Chappell becomes, if this is going to be a public tournament, A, how many people even know who Kevin Chappell is, or just look at course history and see he came T7 last year, and B, don't even know about this back injury, Colin. Like that would be my biggest thing. People know Bryson DeChambeau, even the general public, because he was so hyped as an amateur. He wears the goofy hat, and his stats align for the DFS community to love him too, and he's such a good price that, he could carry close to 20% ownership, I think.
Yeah, I think DeChambeau, Steele, and Chappell, anyone who builds models off of strokes gained data and a lot of the stuff that Fantasy National obviously has is going to fall in love with these guys as values, because they do fit the mold for Augusta really well. And they also are able to score on those par fives that we're talking about. So it feels like a range where the market is kind of accurately flagged the highest projected guys. I have Chappell around 18%, DeChambeau around 16%. So I'm a little bit closer to your numbers there, just a slight flip between Chappell and DeChambeau. And I think that in, maybe contests that are full more of DFS regulars, that people are aware of Chappell's back injury, but I definitely don't think that's something that is being widely talked about in sort of the public spectrum as far as Masters content.
So the only one that I have planned to fade right now out of that range is Steele, yet he seems to be the lowest owned of that collection of four. What do I do if all these guys are chalk? Does it even make sense to take them anymore? Because I want to. I think they can play well.
Yeah, it's so tough for me. I think like one of the things I try to do is have the leverage score comparing the top 20 probabilities to the ownership to help guide me through that decision. And that would say to look to other guys as values, either by getting outside of this range altogether and going up to the $7,000 range, or by taking a flyer on some of the 2% guys like a Jason Duffner or a Kyle Stanley or Martin Keimer, who, obviously is coming off the injury. So a little bit of risk there because he didn't look great last week. But it seems like they provide a little bit more leverage. I think the important thing, though, is if you are going to grab someone like a Kevin Chappell, then just don't put together the team that's Chappell, Rose, Tiger, Bubba. It's going to be so owned.
Yeah, so I think that Kevin Chappell makes a lot of sense. And if you started your team off, well, we know that wherever Jason Day plays well, then Kevin Chappell is going to follow suit and play well too. So if you want to do a Jason Day, John Rahm build at the start, or even Dustin Johnson and Sergio to start your teams, I think you can then take the chalkier Chappell and Bryson and that kind of thing. What do you make of it, Jeff? Did those numbers just get, let's say I guaranteed you that both guys were going to be 18%. We knew that right now. Would you still play them?
No. No. If you're going to tell me they're at 18%, no, I'm okay pivoting off of them because there is a tremendously low floor on both of them. Chappell with the injury and Bryson, he's just super volatile. So if you could tell me that a fifth of the field could be gone if they bomb out, yeah, I'm going to pivot.
All right, so what are the pivots in this range then that we're looking at? I know, Colin, you threw out Stanley and Duffner. I don't have a ton of confidence in those guys, but I understand that, listen, they're both really good ball strikers. We're targeting ball striking here. That should play itself out. Is there a line, Jeff, where you're going where you're not taking anyone below? Because I'm still trying to talk myself into Siwoo Kim. But I had the outright bet on him, and now he's dropped to 300 to 1, which is just fantastic. So I might have to leave him out of my DraftKings lineups, but I don't think anyone below Kyle Stanley for me at $6,800. I might throw in a Jimmy Walker, but I don't really know where I want to go in this range outside of those guys, and I think that's the problem that a lot of people are getting into.
68's my low with Kyle Stanley. And I will own some of him, but no lower than that. I always like Austin Cook. I don't really like him this week. And everyone else down there just doesn't do much for me. So if you're looking at pivots, I would go Stanley. I will probably own Duffner as a tertiary guy, although I don't love him. But I would probably be in favor of actually reconstructing your rosters to get up to that low 7K range if you're looking to pivot off of Bryson, Steele, and Chappell.
Colin, what about you? Where are you going with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't have someone from Daily Roto on without bringing up Francesco Molinari as a possible pivot.
Oh.
So him and Duffner are very similar players to me. I think they have, a reasonably high probability to make the cut. I think that if they're playing well, they can finish inside the top 20. And so if they're the last guy in your roster, I think, those are two percenters. But I prefer Chappell, Steele, DeChambeau just outright from a projection perspective. But in the top heavy millionaire maker, those are guys I'd consider. But I think I'm more prone to trying to find a different way to construct my roster altogether, either by paying up at the top to be contrarian or by hitting that 7K range that we went through where there's a lot of guys that carry pretty reasonable ownership projections.
Okay, so before we get out of here, I want to ask both of you, and Jeff, we'll start with you. Of the sub 7-ish% players in the $7,000 range, who are two that you're going to be on?
I'm going to have Effie Barnrat because I think he'll be under 7. And I would say maybe Brian Harmon. I don't know. I have him about 8%, 7 or 8%. So I would put him in there as well.
Colin, where would you go in this range if you were, like we said, trying to scrape for this year's Thomas Peters, a guy in this range, 7% or below with tremendous upside potentially for your lineups?
I think the guys that I'd be looking at would be Tony Finau and Patrick Cantlay. I know there are plenty of reasons to question it, whether or not it's Cantlay's short game or Finau being his first trip to Augusta, but I could see those guys having Peters-esque performances if their ball striking's on. Then the rest of the game wouldn't matter quite as much.
All right, so for me, I'm going to end up going with a lot of Xander Schauffele, and I think I'll have enough Ian Poulter. I just think that he's playing well right now and has a very good Masters history. I think he can ride this momentum a little bit. I don't think he's going to win, but I think he can definitely top 10. I believe he has a top 10 4 of his past 7 trips to Augusta. He seems to have these greens figured out just a little bit, and if he's going to come in playing hot, we saw this at the Open Championship last year. When Poulter gets hot, he tends to stay hot for 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time. So hopefully he can continue with that momentum and the ball striking stays the same and the putter stays above average. It doesn't need to be lights out like Rory was at API. It just needs to be good. And I think that Poulter can get that done. Plus he has a good enough short game and knows the course well enough that he can get himself out of trouble and not make a ton of big numbers and get through to the cut and try to not put up scores to take yourself out of the tournament. So a bit of a safer guy with Poulter and then the riskier guy with the first timer in Xander Schauffele for me. Final thing, highest owned players, 3 overall highest players. I think that Justin Rose is going to be the highest owned player in the Millionaire Maker. I think that Paul Casey is going to be second, and I think that Jordan Spieth is going to be third. Colin, who are your top 3?
So I think that Justin Rose will end up being the highest owned player. I think that Tiger Woods will be a close second as far as the highest owned player. And then I think that Bubba Watson will end up as the third highest owned player.
Jeff?
I have Rose, Spieth, Woods. Top 3.
Are there any fades on that list for you? Because I'm not playing Paul Casey. I haven't decided on Bubba yet, but I'm not playing Tiger Woods. And I'm not looking forward to it, but that's the decision that I've decided to make my stance. So Jeff, any of those high-owned guys that you're just not playing?
Well, I would say Tiger would be a fade for me in the top 3, but I could hear Ricky Fowler as well. If you would consider him highly owned in the teens, I could fade him as well.
Colin, any of those guys that you're fading?
I think I'll end up fading Justin Rose just because of the fact that I do like a lot of the pivots off of him. And I think that the ownership could get extreme. And even in the best case, you're probably not getting it, below 25%. So he's the most likely guy I'm going to fade. It's a super painful and scary one just because I do think he has a really good chance of doing well here. So maybe I'll hedge with a top 5 bet on him or something. So I'm a little bit protected to the downside if he ends up going off.
Okay, before we get out of here on the DraftKings Millionaire Maker ownership projection show, so let's not talk about projections anymore. If you were to play cash games, where do you think the starting point should be? Like, would you play Spieth in a cash game, Jeff, or do you just think going like Rose, Casey, Sergio to start your team is the proper way to do this?
I think you just hit them right there, Pat. Those would be my top 3 in the cash games. Would be Rose, Casey, Sergio right there. I don't think you need to go all the way up to Spieth. You just lock in those solid value plays, and I think maybe a Kuchar then at 7,600 if you can get him in as well. I think that's the way to go.
What do you think, Colin?
Yeah, we actually had flagged those 4 guys. We said if you start with Rose, Casey, Sergio, Kuchar, then you kind of have a decent amount of salary to spend on the rest of your 2 spots, and you can go a couple different ways with it. So I think that would be how I would go about starting things. I think it's probably a bad way to go about starting things that way for tournaments because the fact that a couple different content providers all landed on that exact same approach means that it could be a popular one for tournaments.
This is true. All right, so let's get out of here. Colin, once again, tell everyone about the Daily Roto product.
Yeah, we got a trial this week. So $1 access for the week of the Masters with the promo Masters at dailyroto.com/premium. You can get access to not just our fantasy golf projections, optimizer and ownership projections, but you can also get a lot of cool betting tools around head-to-heads, 3 balls, and top 20s. So definitely give us a shot.
Jeff, and let everyone know what they can get and what they can consume in terms of content at fantasygolfinsider.com.
Sure. We got all the articles, all the tools. We're specific as far as cash game articles, GPP articles. But if you have a specific question about GPPs, lineup composition, ownership, anything like that, anyone can always email us at info@fantasygolfinsider.com. We're more than happy to help out everybody to help them be winning players.
All right, and I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook, where my betting cheat sheet will appear on Wednesday afternoon at the PME. Again, that's facebook.com/thepme. I have a live chat for all your Masters questions, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the DraftKings Facebook and YouTube page. So you want to fill that up. You can check out my fun player profiles up on the Twitters right now. They're not really informative, but hey, maybe they'll make you laugh just a little bit. Who knows? All my content is out. Like I said, I'll be back Wednesday, Thursday, Friday with the live cut sweat show, and Saturday again to get you all prepped for everything that you need to know about the Masters. Sign up for Fantasy National. Become a member today. Use all the tools that are provided. It's only $7 for a weekly membership. A great time to test it. And hey, if you get it today, you get this and the Heritage, because I love the heritage. It's not like I'm just going away after the Masters. I'm pumping this out. We're going right back with a Masters recap and the heritage on Monday with Feinberg. And finally, the first major of the year, DraftKings package, 2 of them, the full package, $9.99. I'm looking at it right now. It has all historic DraftKings stats from the Millionaire Maker, player capsules, player rankings, cheat sheets from Jeff Ulrich. It's really great. And hey, here's one right now. 6 of the last 9 major Masters champions have ranked inside the top 25 in driving distance on the PGA Tour the year of their victory. Tons of these little nuggets that are in there. It's a really cool pack to have. So $9.99. You can find it in the description of this video or this podcast or in the articles up on DKPlaybook.com. Hope you got all that. Enjoy the Masters. Good luck. If we can't win the $1 million, hope anyone out there does. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
That Mayo experience! Experience!